And now a discussion on relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world. Representatives of the state and defense departments joined Muslim journalists and activists in the discussion. It was hosted by the Muslim...
Welcome everyone to the last session, the day program for the convention. Of course, we'll have the banquet after this. Thanks to all of you for hanging in there. I'm sure it's been a long day of attending a lot of interesting and informative panels, and we hope to leave you with a bang. We are running a few minutes late, just as people are trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started at this point. And I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll go ahead and do the session, and I will try to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions. We are being webcast, and so we will be taking questions from the floor in written format if you hand them to the volunteers, and also online you can submit them, and then if they meet with my approval, I will ask them. Let me introduce our panelists very briefly, and you can read their full bios in the program. I'm going to give you sort of the abbreviated version because it would take most of this session just to go through each of these distinguished panelists' biographies. Starting to my far right, Jonathan Morgenstein works at the Department of Defense as Global Strategic Engagement Fellow. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Director for National Security Policy at Third Way, which is a progressive think tank. He has also worked in the past as Senior Program Officer for the U.S. Institute of Peace, and he is a captain in the Marine Reserves. He did active tours in Bosnia and 2 tours in Iraq. Tamara Wittes, seated 2 seats over from me, is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. She is currently overseeing the Middle East Partnership Initiative and the broader Mideast and North Africa Initiative. She has in the past directed the Middle East Democracy and Development Project at the Saban Center, which is part of the Brookings Institute, which is a well-known think tank in Washington, D.C. She has served as Middle East Specialist at U.S. Institute of Peace. She has edited 1 book and has authored a forthcoming work on, I believe, on democracy in the Arab world. It's out, actually. It's come out, okay. Laila al-Marayati, seated to my immediate right here, is the spokesperson for the Muslim Women's League. She has served on the MPAC board in the past. She was a member of the U.S. delegation to the UN Conference on Women in Beijing. She also served as a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She is the chairperson of Kinder USA, which is a charity that focuses on children's needs in Palestine. And she has a day job as an OBGYN as a professor at the USC School of Medicine. Our 4th panelist is Aslam Abdullah, who has not joined us, and hopefully he will very shortly. I will introduce him if he makes it to our session. I'm going to jump right in, and we're going to go for about 45 minutes here with the panelists, and then we'll save the last 15 minutes for questions, and we'll end on time at 6:15. I'm going to start off, basically, the panel is labeled Improving U.S.-Muslim World Relations. And when I was asked to moderate this panel, I looked at that question, I said, well, does that question even make sense? We can speak of improving U.S.-Turkish relations, U.S.-Pakistan relations, U.S.-Iranian relations, but can we speak of U.S.-Muslim world relations? Does that term even make sense? And who in the Muslim world are we trying to relate to? Are we trying to relate to the government? Are we trying to relate to the mass of public opinion? Are we trying to relate to elites in those countries, not necessarily in the government, but who dominate those societies? So I would like to take that as my first question that I'd throw open to the panelists, and let's have you all weigh in on that if you could. Just please go ahead, whoever would like to. Jonathan?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm monitoring the volume properly. I guess I can start with an anecdote. Back a few years ago, I was working as a low-ranking Marine, and one of the senior Marines had asked me, or had proposed something about a terrorist incident. And I said, well, extremist Muslims, and I understand the discussion we had earlier today about how do you label al-Qaeda and their ilk, but I said, extremist Muslims would probably say this about the event. And the senior Marine turned to me and said, do you mean Muslims or extremist Muslims? And I said, well, our Turkish allies that, we just came back from serving with in Bosnia, as well as the Bosnians and the Kosovars, the Muslim Bosnians and Kosovars, probably would say the extremist Muslims. And so it brings the point home that the idea of relating to the Muslim world as a monolithic group, it just doesn't hold water militarily. For the DoD perspective, the way we interact with our allies, the Turkish military, is one of our closest allies within NATO and around the world, is clearly something that we have to deal with in a very different way than how the US military learns to deal with its relationship with Iraqis on the ground in Iraq and Afghans on the ground in Afghanistan and wherever we are in the world. I mean, the Marine Corps does a lot of training exercises with the Senegalese, who I believe 98% of whom are Muslim. And so obviously dealing with Muslim communities everywhere is a different dynamic based on the people you are interacting with. And so the idea of dealing with the Muslim world as a whole, it's not something that the DoD, for the most part, thinks of as a monolithic entity. So.
Yeah, I mean, speaking, is it on? Okay, thank you. Speaking from a State Department perspective also, we actually don't speak in terms of the Muslim world or a Muslim world. And Farah Pandith, who was appointed by Secretary Clinton as the first ever special representative to Muslim communities. And that's really the way we think about this engagement, the new beginning that the president spoke about in Cairo, is it's reaching out to communities of Muslims who exist in a diversity of environments in Muslim majority states, as minority communities in other states around the globe. And so it's really, I think we are all well past the point where we're talking about monolithic conceptions either of a Muslim world or of Islam. And I think what we're trying to do now in building a new kind of partnership is reach, as you said, well beyond governments and talk about citizens, talk about communities in a variety of contexts, and reach out to the diversity of those communities to get a sense of what their different perspectives are, what their different needs are, and what different kinds of partnerships we can build.
I would say it's encouraging to hear that from both of you because that's something we've been arguing for a long time about how the Muslim world is not monolithic, and what applies in the northern states of Nigeria is very different than what applies in Iran. And when you talk, for example, about something as important as Sharia, you can't talk about it in general terms because it looks very different in Pakistan or in parts of Africa, for example. The problem we've had is that there are still elements in American society that want to label Islam that way, want to refer to Islam as a religion that endorses honor killings, for example, in a recent article in USA Today, and talks about it in that general sense. For what reason, you can only speculate, but it gives this sense that creates a certain hysteria and paranoia, the type of which might have led to the Swiss to vote not to have minarets anymore in Switzerland because of this sort of Islamophobic, xenophobic atmosphere. So it's good to know that this is happening for the people who are making decisions in our government on the ground, but we still are faced with this in terms of our society and what we as Muslims have to deal with, and one element of that does come from the media, I think, too, as well.
Thank you for those comments. Aslam Abdullah has joined us, and let me just introduce him briefly, and of course you can read his bio in its entirety. I'm going to very briefly summarize it. He is the editor of the Muslim Observer newspaper, director of the Islamic Society of Nevada. He is a trustee of the American Federation of Muslims of Indian Origin, And he is also the author of 11 books and over 700 papers and articles. Very prolific writer, obviously. He has spoken often on national and local media, and he is also former vice chairman of MPAC, so he has a long-standing connection with MPAC. Aslam, I'd like to welcome you to the panel. We were just making some remarks about the framework of discussion, whether it makes sense to speak in terms of U.S.-Muslim world relations rather than U.S. relations with specific Muslim communities or specific Muslim nations. And does that framework make sense as a framework of analysis?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I'm late. There's a Benny Hinn show going on, and they wanted me to be there. But I decided to come here. Well, I think the notion that the U.S. should engage with the Muslim world precisely because of 9/11, or because of what happened after that, is probably not very well founded in history, because our relationship with the Muslim world has been almost 225 years old. And in these 225 years, we have had at least 56 times involved militarily in any part of the Muslim world. In these 225 years, we've had at least 3 major wars in the initial stages of our independence, with Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco. Our first war hero comes from those wars. And the memories of those kind of relationships are not very, what you call, cordial and very happy in the minds of those people who are part of the foreign policy apparatus. But what basically also has happened is that during the last 25 or so years, in terms of our relationship with the Muslim world, we have been seen as a country that is not very respectful to human life in the Muslim world. Almost 12,000 Americans have been killed since 1983, but 288,000 Muslims have lost their life as a result of our intervention in those countries. Fred Thomas last week wrote that the United States has intervened in the Muslim country primarily to support the Muslim democratic causes. But Patrick Seal, who is one of the journalists stationed in the Middle East, says that if the United States stopped killing Muslims, certainly the relationship between the two countries would improve. So we have a lot of tensions, but a lot of potentials also. Despite the fact that all these things happening, the United States was the only country that intervened in Bosnia and Kosovo. Despite the fact that we had these kind of tensions, the United States was the only country that led the movement against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan and armed the Taliban and armed the Afghan freedom fighters and basically gave Pakistan the green signal to go ahead and all those things. What best we can describe that definitely our foreign policy does not make any rational understanding when it comes to Muslim, Arabs, and the Middle East. There has been confusion.
All right, Aslam. I think let me just follow up on what you're saying there, because I think that you would. One line of argument is that the United States, by engaging in certain wars, obviously Afghanistan and Iraq are the biggest ones right now, that this has impacted the opinion of the United States throughout majority Muslim countries all over the world in a negative way. And that certainly during the Bush administration, we saw opinions of the United States sink quite low in public opinion polling. But then on the flip side, the United States could argue, or those that support American policy could argue, well, you're not taking into account that the United States did in fact intervene on the behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, did not intervene on behalf of Muslims in Kosovo, in Somalia when there was a famine, and in Kuwait when Kuwait was occupied by Saddam Hussein's forces. And then of course there was the earthquake in Pakistan, there was the tidal wave and the rescue effort post that in Indonesia. Certainly the United States was viewed favorably by those people that benefited from that. So I think to kind of throw back at you in that sense, is it too narrow to judge the United States only by the worst things that have happened, or only by the best things that have happened, or should there be some way of taking all of these elements into account?
That's why I mentioned it's rather confusing when it comes to the Middle East, the Arab world, and the Muslims. Then it's confusing, because if we go back to the early 50s, we find that the United States was split on the issue of recognition of the State of Israel. For instance, the State Department was opposed, and President Truman was basically advocating the recognition of the state. Until 56, we did not support the State of Israel. We were basically opposed to even supporting it through arms or through any, we did not even enter into any kind of negotiations or treaties with the State of Israel. So it was confusion in that particular sense, that even in the administration of John F. Kennedy, we had the problem with the State of Israel, and certainly the relations were always not very cordial. So what basically I'm saying is that in terms of the United States relationship with the Muslim world, despite the fact that the Muslim world accounts for 18% of jobs in the United States through its imports and exports, we basically have $500 billion export and import with the Muslim world, which account for 18% of the jobs in this country, and also in those. So from that perspective, you find that even from the perspective of the domestic issues and domestic politics, we have always been wavering from one end to the other in terms of developing a rational policy towards the Muslim world. And the question that need to be asked, that why should we have a rational policy towards the Muslim world? I think the issue that we should be asking is that should we have a rational foreign policy?
Okay, well, let me move the discussion a little forward here.
May I ask that?
Yes, go right ahead.
I think the idea of a rational policy, as you seem to be describing it, would not necessarily take into account both different developments through history, or, like we were talking about, the broad array of possibilities, whether it's from Morocco to Indonesia. And so our policies vis-a-vis what's going on in Sudan might change over time, as well as, and one of the issues that wasn't mentioned, and granted we didn't take action in Darfur, but that is an issue that President Bush did speak out about, and there were a few other leaders throughout the world that mentioned that. And so, just because we don't necessarily do the exact same thing across all countries, I think a lot of the time that can be taken into account, because our interests might, in one area, in terms of economics, be more important, and in other areas, the security interests are more important. And just like every other country in the world, we have to take into a balance of different interests at different times in different places with different communities in different countries.
I would just comment real quickly that we understand that, and as Americans, we know that our government is going to be pragmatic. But when you look at attitudes abroad, and even though, as we said, Muslims are not monolithic, they still, as a group, sometimes share certain sentiments that are important towards the United States. And it's that inconsistency and this sense that, well, what is the criteria that you use to decide when you're going to intervene and when you're not? And if you say human rights and support for democracy in one instance, and then you don't say it in another, and there's this underlying sense that maybe it's not that. Our interests really are security, our interests are oil, our interests are other things. And there's this sense that there's a lack of transparency and not being really straightforward with people who clearly can see how things are. And so this is why the US keeps tripping itself up, and one of the most sensitive issues obviously is Israel-Palestine, because, for example, a year ago, pretty much this month, there was an assault on Gaza. The Goldstone report came out and confirmed the kinds of casualties. The US was basically silent during the attack on Lebanon and so forth. So there's this sense, well, what are the standards? Is there a double standard? Is there some form of hypocrisy that undermines our credibility as an American government in that part of the world that people sort of have to take stock with? And I think it's a reality that affects our community here and Muslims throughout the rest of the world. So.
Laila,
I appreciate what you're saying, and I think there are a couple of points that are important to make here. The first is that this administration, beginning with the president's visit to Istanbul, continuing with his speech in Cairo, continuing with other travels and meetings and diplomacy that's gone on since then, is trying to do two things. Number one, to speak frankly, and I think we should all agree that the Cairo speech, if nothing else, was a very frank discussion of a lot of the issues that have caused tension over the past years. So to speak frankly about issues on which we agree and issues on which there are differences, to recognize that Muslim communities are diverse, that they exist in a variety of different places, that different communities have different issues that are most important to them, different priorities with respect to the United States. And what we want to do is pursue relationships that go beyond the high politics, the things that are at the top of the news every day, and that we understand people often think about first when they think about the United States. So we are engaged on those issues. President Obama has been engaged since day one, as you know, trying to pursue peace in the Middle East, trying to get the parties back to negotiations so that we can achieve a two-state solution, and we're continuing to do that work. At the same time, though, to take this relationship beyond high politics, beyond security interests, beyond trade interests, to the people-to-people level, and to establish new partnerships that get at local needs and local concerns, and to build those partnerships in a way that's real, it's meaningful, that has some meat on the bones, some actual activity.
Tamara, let me follow up on. Let me follow up on your comments here, and I think what I was struck by was the Pew Research Group did some polling throughout the Muslim world at a variety of Muslim majority countries, and looked at the favorability that the U.S. was viewed by in those populations, and compared the numbers that we are generating now under Obama and then the numbers that were visible under the last few years of the prior administration. And there's been obviously large dramatic jumps. The numbers are looking much better. Let me ask you from the government policy standpoint, is this a goal of the administration to increase the popularity of the United States with the populations of these countries? Or is that something that is not all that important in terms of a foreign policy goal? And number two, do you think, and I would like the other panelists to weigh in, do you think that the change in these numbers is due to actual substantive changes between Bush and Obama, or do you think that it is mostly stylistic changes in the tone and in the kind of language that is being used? Well, and I'm trying to get you to go off of message and get fired from the State Department, so just let me clarify that.
Please don't get me fired. Well, let me say first, I think we all like to be liked, and of course we're all encouraged when we see shifts in public opinion worldwide that show greater support for the United States. But we spend a lot of time in the State Department talking about indicators for success, and how do we know if we are following up on the president's words in Cairo in a way that's meaningful? How do we know if we are actually putting meat on the bones, as I said? And I think if we took public opinion as our main indicator, we would be making a mistake. Because public opinion can be affected by a variety of factors, only some of which we have any control over. And public opinion, as we certainly know from our experience in this country, can be fickle. So I think we have to go beyond that kind of superficial indicator. And what we're really trying to do is, as I said, to go local. And the program that I manage at the State Department, the Middle East Partnership Initiative, is granted just within the Middle East, the countries from Morocco to Iraq and the Gulf, is a program that is working to go local, to bring U.S. foreign assistance to the local level. We have about half of the projects we do are proposed by local NGOs in Arab countries to our embassies, and we provide, in many cases, very small grants to local groups to do work that they see as the priority for their community. And that's just a small example of the kind of substance that we're putting behind this idea of a new kind of partnership. So I don't think it's just tone. I think we are trying to put a lot of substance behind it. I think we're trying to make it visible to average citizens, not just on their TV screens, but in the streets of their towns.
And I guess coming from the Department of Defense, obviously the kind of relationship is going to be a much more security context. In the aftermath of the President's announcement of the refinement of the Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy, Turkey, I believe Turkey was among the NATO allies that collectively announced just in the last couple of days that they're going to be contributing an additional 7,000 with the possibility of increasing, I think, up to 10,000 more troops for the Allied effort in Afghanistan. And I was actually just looking at the same Pew poll numbers that you were looking at. I'd like to note that, I guess probably because he spent some part of his childhood there, Indonesia has a significant, large majority of support for the new president. But across the board, I do think public opinion in other parts of the world does matter, because I think it would be more difficult to get that kind of support, I think, from our allies, especially a country like Turkey, if the president didn't have that kind of increased support around the world. And that's a very tangible sign, or not even a sign, it's a very tangible fact that public opinion matters. Increases
the flexibility that the president has in terms of getting policy that he wants.
Getting policy that he wants, and frankly, it's an increase in our ability to keep our country secure. There's been an increase in terms of intelligence collaboration and law enforcement collaboration in parts of the world, explicitly because governments feel more comfortable being seen as close with the United States than under the previous administration. It's a very tangible reality that helps keep our country secure.
I think the accuracy of the polls depends who is conducting and who is censoring. The second thing that needs to be taken into consideration is that the perceptions in the Muslim world or anywhere else will change when the policy changes. The fact is that on the one hand, we are supporting despots. On the one hand, we are supporting monarchs. On the one hand, we are supporting those who are the violators of human rights, who basically censor everything, who have no regard to human life and human dignity. And on the other hand, we want to basically give the image that we defend democracy and we defend human rights. Certainly, the people of the streets are not dumb. They understand what basically is happening. And unless we take a strong and bold stand, and that's what I say, that we cannot have a rational understanding of our foreign policy in that particular respect, despite the fact that we stand for the values. Our State Department's official motto says that we will stand for democracy and security. And the Congress makes that kind of resolution, and the President talks about all those things. But when it comes to the actual supporting, we were the first one who supported Musharraf. We were the one who basically are behind Hosni Mubarak. We are the one who are against, with all the despots, whose record in terms of human rights is worse than many of the communist dictators. So we have to be very, very careful in terms of where we stand, and certainly here in that particular respect. My understanding is that the State Department and the Department of Defense, despite their huge efforts, we spend nearly $459 billion, and the State Department has spent $53 billion in all its activities. You have not been able to hire people who could understand the culture, language, and the people of the Muslim world. Is still in the State Department and the Defense Department, we don't have more than 200 language experts of any of these Muslim countries. Still in these countries, we don't have a substantial study of any Muslim country that could give us an accurate understanding. We still have problems with our State and Defense Department officials in describing Afghan as part of the Middle East. So we have that kind of understanding, where the policies is based on certain irrational understanding, not on accuracy, not on facts. Rather, it is based on some of the what you call medieval writings that have become part of our political literature, or biased, or what you call discriminatory kind of understanding of the Muslim world. And in that particular respect, I feel effort needs to be done, and in that respect, the Muslim community can definitely play a definite role, but unfortunately, is still in this administration, that bridge between Muslim and the State Department or this, the White House has not been built that could give Muslims the confidence to say clearly that these are the interests that we think that the United States should pursue in foreign policy as far as the Muslim world is concerned, and it would benefit the country, and it would benefit the democracy, it would benefit human rights, it would benefit things that we swear by our Constitution.
Did you want to make a comment, Laila?
I think that, as you talked about, the U.S. is trying to move away from high politics where we get into some of this tricky area where there may be disagreements. But I guess my only point is that there is a connection. And
and we still do high politics.
Right.
We
but
haven't quit doing that. We have to do that, and we will continue to do that, but we don't want to only do that.
Right. But I guess my point is just from having experience trying to do humanitarian work in the Gaza Strip, for example, where the Hamas is considered a terrorist organization and you can't do any work with them. And the USAID projects, for example, in places that I visited were ended as soon as they took over. And so whether USAID can establish a presence again on the ground to affect lives, granted it's a small area, it's 1.5 million people, it's not a huge country where maybe you could have a huger impact if you're investing in literacy projects or economic empowerment, but it's those small stories that get broadcast around the world that really make a difference. And if we are only going to work with some groups and not others because of the high politics, then it makes it more difficult for the local effort to really have the impact in a major way that the United States may be looking for. So just want to reinforce the importance that if there's a huge gap, you can only go so far with those efforts, especially if you're focusing on certain groups to the exclusion of others because of the politics of that region.
I'm going to kind of move along, Jonathan. I do want to get you in on the next point, so be ready with the microphone there. What I'm hearing a lot is, on the one hand, there are points being made about what the United States is doing in terms of a positive sense, in terms of engaging with Muslim communities around the world and trying to develop a better understanding of the Muslim world, and perhaps dealing with some of the long-standing issues that are going on, and trying to improve both on a high politics level and on a local level. And then there's also some very serious concerns about the underlying motivators of American foreign policy, the gap between our ideals and the reality, the gap between what the United States foreign policy may be at its best and what it may be at its worst. I think this raises one issue that is something that is quite the fodder for political science classrooms for university students, is what is the legitimate basis of a country's foreign policy? Is it strictly a very narrowed focus on what is perceived as national interest, or should it be allegiance to a higher set of moral principles, or some mix of both? And I think I'm going to leave that to individual audience members to think about that. I don't think we need to answer that question here, but I do want to sort of get at that topic, and the way I want to get at that topic is this. There are clearly issues out there in foreign policy, in relationships between the United States and Afghanistan, the U.S. and Iraq, the U.S. and Israel and Palestine, issues that are of great importance to the United States. And then there are issues that are of great importance to Muslim Americans or Muslim populations in other parts of the world. And I just kind of thought about them, and to me, it appears to be that the most important issues to the United States is preventing another terrorist attack, to deal with the issue of nuclear proliferation in Iran, to deal with developing a viable exits from Afghanistan and Iraq, and to make sure that there is security of the world's energy supplies and oil supplies. For Muslim communities, and we've already had several questions on this, one of the issues that is of great concern is justice for the Palestinians. Another issue that is of great concern is Kashmir, and then Aslam has pointed out the disconnect between providing for democracy or supporting democracy and our alliance with the Saudi monarchs or the dictatorships in Egypt. Those issues seem to be of more importance to Muslim communities. To what extent, and let me just get to the question here, to what extent are the goals or the issues that are of importance to the United States and the issues that are of importance to Muslim communities so divergent that there's just not enough overlap for either side to really be satisfied with what they see going on with the other party? And to what extent is there overlap or the possibility of useful progress? And I will open that up.
Yeah, I think you pose that in a fascinating way, at least for me, Nair, because I'm a political scientist. And, you know, having taught in those college classrooms and taught U.S. foreign policy and international relations, I can tell you, you know, as a political scientist, how do we conceive of our national interests? Interests derive from values. We have our national values. Those are what guide our sense of our interests. Our policies derive from our interests. So there's a hierarchy here, and at the top of it is values. And I think that there's already been a lot of discussion over the course of this conference about the values inherent in America's civic culture and the ways in which Muslims in America interact with those values. So I don't have to go on about that. I think the values that are at the center of American national identity and American foreign policy are values that we share, and indeed values that are shared by other communities around the world. I don't think that these are unique to America. I don't think that the aspiration to be an active participant in your community and in your government and in determining your future is something that's unique to Americans. I think that that's a value that's shared around the world. The human rights that we enjoy in the United States, that we seek to defend in our courts when we feel they've been infringed, those are the same human rights that Iranians are out demanding in the streets from their own government, and we are standing up and witnessing and calling for the Iranian government to protect and defend those rights. So I think that we have a lot of values in common, not just with Muslims around the world, but with the citizens of the globe. And Secretary Clinton has come out and said very clearly that we're going to pursue our values and our common interests and our common values with communities around the world through partnership, through the power of our example, and through the empowerment of people. And that partnership is going to exist at a lot of different levels. Sometimes it will be a government-to-government partnership. And security and stability are values that are shared across some societies, and we will have government-to-government partnerships to try and protect those values. We are in the process of building a new, broader, long-term partnership with the government of Pakistan that is now a democratic government, so that we can pursue security and stability for the Pakistani people who have been some of the most victimized from terrorism in the past few years, and indeed just this week. So I think that we seek to pursue our values through our policies, and we don't just operate at the level of high politics as we do that. There are a variety of things we do in our dialogue with governments and at the people-to-people level through the empowerment of people to try and pursue those values. So it's not always going to happen in an immediate sense that you'll see a change, but I think that the values that we hold in common with Muslim communities around the world are evident to both of us, and I think what we are seeking is a way that we can manifest that commonality through our policies and through our programs.
Laila or Jonathan or Aslam?
I think there's no disconnect between the values of Muslims and the constitutional values that every American citizen aspires for. There's no disconnect there. We all believe in those things, and the issue is not that of the supremacy of the values. The issue is that how those values are projected and implemented in the real world, in the political world. And this is where we find, as a student of American foreign policy, American politics, I find basically a disconnect between our values and what we have been doing. There has been a series of irrationality in terms of our decisions, in terms of supporting regimes that have basically been detrimental to our own healthy political growth in those world. We have always been trying to interfere in certain parts of the world without realizing the implications and without involving and adopting the right policy and right understanding. And this is where the problem is, that if we really believe in those values that we all believe in, then definitely we must provide some substantial proof for that in terms of what we do. And that has not been the case in the last 60 years as far as the Muslim world is concerned. I mean, this is a clear-cut understanding, and certainly as a political science, if the studies are conducted, you would realize that many a times we have made blunders in several parts of the Muslim world. For giving you an example about Iran, for instance, 53 Iran. We were afraid of the democratic development of the Iranian society. What did we do there? We intervened, we interfered. We basically totally annihilated the democratic process that was going on, and that could have basically led to the emergence of a democratic society, not only in Iran, but in other parts of the world, and now we are paying the price for that kind of thing. The same thing is happening with what basically with Egypt. The same thing happened with what we did the Saudi Arabia and all those kind of things, where the democratic movements were developing and growing, but we did not pay any attention to that. We did not have that kind of allowed those regimes to suppress them.
Aslam, let me, Jonathan, go ahead, but I want to ask Aslam a serious question on this. The question is, I hear a lot of Muslims criticize U.S. alliances with dictatorships of the Muslim world as intervening on the behalf of dictators and against democracy. Do you think that the United States should reorient its policy towards one of neutrality towards those countries, sort of strict non-interference, and if the dictatorship stays in power, then that's the way it is? Or should the United States actively try to undermine dictatorships in the Muslim world and promote democratic change? Where do you come down on, do you think the United States should not interfere at all, or do you think the United States should interfere in a way to promote democracy?
I mean, we have two alternatives. One is very ideal libertarian kind of point of view, that we stop interference in any part of the world, and that is not going to happen. We will always be interfering. We will always be involved in world politics. We will always be having a foreign policy. In that particular respect, what basically we need to do is to basically look at the growth of the history and the movement of the history. The movement of the history is not on the side of despots. It is not on the side of those people who are human rights violators. It is on the side of those people who believe in human dignity. And we should align ourselves with those forces. And there are many in the Muslim world. And the problem is that we don't understand that Muslim world.
Jonathan, I want to get you in here because I know you've been chomping at the bit there.
Well, I think I agree with the notion that very often we don't completely understand a specific place or what specifically is going on. Personally, again, I served on the ground in Iraq with the Marine Corps, and during my first tour in 2004 and 2005, it was evident that we really didn't entirely understand a lot of the dynamics that were going on. And one of the panelists from earlier in the day had noted that one of the silver linings of a lot of the events of the past few years is how the Muslim American community has really mobilized in the form of organizations like MPAC. And I think one of the silver linings of the American military presence in Afghanistan and Iraq is that you have literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of young American men and women from across the entire country who have been interacting on a daily basis with young Iraqi and Afghan, mostly men, for years. And that kind of cultural exchange and mutual understanding, and a lot of times walking along, having each other's back, literally, unfortunately, bleeding and dying and fighting and surviving together, allows them to build an understanding that is otherwise absolutely impossible. And so I think our cultural awareness as a country of Muslim communities has grown and is growing. Part of the reason why we are here is because, at least I can speak for the Department of Defense, to acknowledge that in recognition of the troubles we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq, that the Department of Defense does need to, I don't want to say reach out, because Muslim Americans are as part and parcel of the Department of Defense as Catholic, Jewish, Presbyterian Americans, but to begin to get a greater expertise and understanding in these environments that we have to operate in order to ensure all of our collective defense. And so, yes, our understanding is imperfect, and it desperately needs improvement. And please help us improve, is kind of what I'm saying.
I'd just like to say, I just have to say, I mean, I agree that these are benefits that we couldn't have imagined for kids coming from different parts of the United States that wouldn't even have had a passport to travel anywhere otherwise. But I just have to say that it's unfortunate that that cultural exchange has to happen in the context of war and violence and bloodshed. And I know you agree with that. And it seems to me that if we mobilize the Peace Corps, for example, if we put all our efforts and energy into, supporting jobs and efforts and projects overseas that promote development, that promote clean water, that promote literacy, that promote economic empowerment, how we could accomplish the same thing with young kids who need jobs, and they might just go somewhere else where we've outsourced our jobs to, but still the people living in the streets are suffering. So that would take sort of a mental shift. We take advantage of the situation as it is, for better or worse. That's where we are right now, and we should. But it's just unfortunate to me as an American to think, we couldn't have accomplished that in some other way.
I agree. I'm not advocating war as a means of cultural exchange. I'm saying there's this small silver lining of these situations.
I had you as a warmonger, but maybe not.
May I add one thing here?
Yes.
I'm really glad, Laila, that you raised that, because I think that there's not a very strong sense here in the U.S., much less in Muslim communities abroad, about what the United States is doing to pursue precisely the goals that you just described as aspirations. Since the Cairo speech in June, we've set up a slew of new initiatives to try and pursue some of those ideas. The president is going to be hosting in March in Washington an entrepreneurship summit that is going to be bringing leading business entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, high-tech entrepreneurs from Muslim countries around the world to DC to engage with their counterparts in the public sector and private sector here in the US to build new partnerships, to try and promote investment, to promote skills development. We've scaled up exchange programs. We're going to be sending science envoys, including prominent Arab Americans and Muslim Americans among them, although not exclusively by any means, to countries around the Middle East and beyond, to Muslim majority countries, because one of the things that we've heard in the listening that we've been doing throughout this year, and especially since the Cairo speech, has been a desire to partner more on science and technology issues, and that there just hasn't been enough effort by the United States to engage on those issues. So we're trying to scale that up in our diplomacy, science diplomacy. We have launched a new project that Secretary Clinton spoke about when she visited Morocco last month, Civil Society 2.0. Now, Secretary Clinton comes out of nonprofit advocacy work for children and families. She is a huge believer in the power of civil society. And she wants to put more resources as a department and as a government behind the empowerment of civic groups in Muslim communities around the world. So we have a new project that is going to be helping civic groups build their technological capacity so that they can reach out to young people, and also just to build their other capacities so that they can be more effective within their own society and in dialogue with government. So in all those ways, we're trying to build up precisely the capacity that you say is needed to round out, to balance the nature of our engagement with these communities and with this part of the world, and to make the point that, yes, the U.S. has interests around the world. We're a global power, we're a global economy, and we're going to be engaged around the world, but we don't only want to be engaged at the level of high politics and diplomacy, and we don't only want to be engaged in the business of doing business. We want to be engaged as an ally with those within their own societies who are seeking to build a better future and to be a force for good within their own communities. We do want to partner with those people. We are working to build those partnerships. We've been putting resources behind it in a variety of ways over the years, but we're scaling up our initiatives now.
We're kind of gotten up to about 6 o'clock now, so I wanted to spend the last little bit of time here taking some questions. And there are several questions that all touch on the theme of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think it would be remiss of us not to at least discuss that to some extent. As I'm sure most of the audience is aware, and certainly the panelists are aware, the Obama administration came in to Washington with a clear commitment to a two-state solution, and they put significant pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister to at least verbally acknowledge that as a goal. There has been a disagreement with the Israelis over the settlements, and there was at least an initial attempt to get the Israelis to stop all settlement building. That has not been where we are at now. At this point, we are at a bit of an impasse. I think the administration was hoping to get negotiations going quite rapidly, but so far we have a standstill. And I'd like to get Tamara's input on where things stand from a State Department standpoint, and also the other panelists to weigh in on this issue and where we think we should go. And one element that I would like all of you to address, if you could, is to what extent is solving the Israeli-Palestinian issue going to affect U.S.-Muslim world relations in a more global sense? Is this something that has a huge impact, or is this something that is a conflict that, once it's resolved, does not fundamentally change the way the U.S. and Muslim countries or Muslim communities will be relating to each other? So go ahead.
Okay, well, let me talk about the diplomatic side of things, since that's the world that I'm living in right now. What the impact will be if we get to conflict resolution, which I certainly hope that we'll do, and soon. I think that's an impact that will vary place to place, and and different people will have to decide for themselves how to judge that. But let me just talk to you about what we're doing. We're not at an impasse. It's tough. If it weren't tough, it would have been done by now. But I can tell you, Senator Mitchell's office is right across the hall from my office. And I see every day the level of activity that is taking place there. And Senator Mitchell is not a man who believes in impasse. He is a patient, determined, committed, principled mediator. And he is working every day, not just with the Israelis and the Palestinians, but with the whole region, because the president's vision is a vision of a two-state solution, but it is also a vision of a comprehensive peace in the region that includes peace between Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon, and the broader relationship between Israel and the Arab states. So he is continuing to work with both sides, trying to improve the atmosphere that can get us back to the negotiations, to persuade both sides that we need to get back to negotiations without preconditions, that we need to get back to the table, because it's at the table where these fundamental issues can be resolved between the parties, and we can get a contiguous, viable Palestinian state where we can get an Israel that lives within secure and recognized borders, so we can get what the two sides need. And what their people deserve. So that work continues every day. At the same time, we're engaged on the ground economically in the West Bank and Gaza. We are engaged in humanitarian assistance in Gaza, and while it's true that USAID is not right now present in Gaza, there is still a lot of US assistance that is flowing into the Strip through the UN and through other implementers. And there's a lot that we're doing to bring Gazan students and others out of Gaza to the West Bank so that they can continue to interact with their fellow Palestinians there, and also to engage in region-wide programs and exchange programs. So by no means are we hands-off in terms of trying to help the people of Gaza. We're still engaged in that work as well. And we're also engaged in the work of trying to shape the opinion environment so that the leaders in the region, because I don't have to tell you that the domestic politics on both sides of this conflict are really, really difficult. But to create an atmosphere where the leaders on both sides feel that they have more flexibility and they can be more empowered to take the tough decisions that they need to take if we're going to get these peace negotiations going. So we're still there, we're committed, we're going to be there every day. Senator Mitchell talks a lot about his experience in Northern Ireland, and the way he describes it is that for 2 years, both sides kept saying no. And he said, I didn't take the first no, I didn't take the second no, I didn't take the 9th no. And after 700 days, they finally said yes. And that's really how he thinks about the work that he's doing. So we're not giving up.
I guess I do have to admit the issue of Gaza is very close to my heart. That's where my relatives live. I was there in May. I don't understand how this siege can keep going and the U.S. can turn an eye away and say we're helping get humanitarian aid in, but when you're there on the ground and you see the level of poverty that people are living under, the way everybody looks the other way to allow these tunnels to exist that have this huge black market so that a sheep for Eid al-Adha costs $450 for one family. This is Egypt on the one side, our ally. This is Israel on the other side, our ally. You have this basic cessation of hostile rocket fire into Israel from the Gaza Strip, and even, you have them doing what they can to keep that under control. So to me, having seen with what the effects are of life there, of people having more donkeys and horses because they can't get fuel on a consistent basis, because they can't get parts to fix things, because there's raw sewage in the streets when it wasn't there 6 years ago, because they can't get the parts, because they're all threatened. And we really never comment on that, or if you're doing it behind closed doors, we don't know about it. And this kind of humanitarian crisis that's man-made is much harder for people to swallow in many of our communities than, say, the U.S. going in and helping in a tsunami that nobody could prevent, or an earthquake or something like that. So I do think it's critical. I think it would go very far, not just to solve this problem, but to really give the people there's a sense of justice and recognition of the suffering that they've endured for the past 60 years. So it needs to go much farther than it has. And also we need to stop talking about Israelis and Palestinians as if they are equals, because they are not. We know that. And that rings hollow every time when you talk about the partners and bringing people, because the Palestinians still are under occupation. They don't have control over, 85% of their lives. So it's important, the language and what's used, to be realistic in how we talk about this. But we also know the American side, the politics and lobbyists and interest groups, and the only last comment I would say on that is sometimes some of us are excluded from sitting at the table because we're labeled a certain way as Islamist or extremist. But when you look at it, really the issue that we're targeted for is our position in support of the Palestinian people, not taking a position against Israel per se, but really supporting Palestinians. And I would hope that in both the State Department, Department of Defense, there is a willingness to look beyond what labels others might put on us to be able to say these people need to belong at the table. So that's how it travels, migrates home, and how we get excluded from even being part of the conversation, which then makes it harder to solve this problem.
The Department of Defense as an institution is actually not involved deeply in, that's a diplomatic wrangle. And if the president says we need your support in this sense, then obviously we give it, but we're not the diplomatic corps, we're the security support for whatever the diplomatic decisions are.
I think we are told that it's a complex issue. In 1947, when the issue of the recognition of Israel came, the State Department made the same kind of plea that it's a complex issue. President Truman acted decisively and recognized. If the President of the United States demonstrates his political will and supports the values that this country stands for, and it stands for the dignity and the human rights of the Palestinians, tomorrow there will be a Palestinian state. There is a lack of support, and there is double standards in terms of judging the human life of Palestinian and the Israelis. There are, and certainly it can be demonstrated, it can be proved, and it is partly because of the domestic politics, electoral politics. Much of what basically Christian right has been saying and doing, that the presence of Israel is a God gift, basically it is the culmination of the religious messianism, that Jesus has to come, and in order for Jesus to come, all those and certainly the last administration bought that kind of argument. It bought that argument, and the State Department went along with that in that particular respect. So to say that we are concerned, no, we are not showing that kind of concern for the human dignity that we otherwise would show to any other life if that life happened to be other than Palestinian.
You know, I don't want to minimize in any way the passion of your views, and I accept the passion with which you speak on this subject. But I really do have to question the idea that this administration has not demonstrated decisive, passionate commitment to this issue. Senator Mitchell was appointed on the second day of this administration. Secretary Clinton's first trip overseas was about this issue, and she went to Ramallah and she met with Abu Mazen to discuss this issue. This has been an everyday concern of this administration. We are working to support the creation of a Palestinian state diplomatically. We are working to support it through our development assistance. We are working on the security side, helping the Palestinian Authority build up a strong, nonpartisan, accountable, human rights supportive security force that can protect the Palestinian people in their population centers. And we work with the Israelis so that when those Palestinian forces are trained and capable, the Israelis give them room to do their work. We do this every day. And I'm not sure, President Truman in 1948, yes, recognized Israel when it declared its independence. But had he not done that, would that have prevented Israel's creation? This president got into office and said, I want a two-state solution. Israeli settlement activity must end. Does that mean that he can snap his fingers and make it happen? President Truman couldn't do it. President Obama can't do it. Now we are doing what we can do.
Well, we can do more. We can do more in terms of recognizing the humanity of the Palestinian. For 60 years, the world as a whole has allowed that entire population to suffer the worst kind of imprisonment in the human history. And certainly this, as if we call ourselves an honest broker, then which we cannot be under the present circumstances. We cannot be because of social, religious, and other political factors. We have to be honest in that particular respect. And then honesty basically demands that we at least recognize the humanity and the right of the Palestinian people to live as a dignified human people with respect to their life, their mind, their property, their family, and their right to labor. None of these things we ever came forward in defense of those people in the last 60 years when it comes the truth. Rather, we stopped those relief agencies under the political threat that originated from the state of Israel. Relief agencies to support the Palestinians in those regions. And those people who supported those relief agencies, they were branded as terrorists, they were branded as unpatriotic. Who are those people to call us unpatriotic? We defend America the same way as you defend, the same way as Bush defends.
So, Aslam, let me have Laila weigh in on this, and then we're going to wrap up this.
I would say, too, that, you know, what we've experienced the previous 8 years really was a difficult time for us. As Muslims living in the United States, looking at American foreign policy, a huge change. And so, although, as you're saying, you know, this administration is doing something different, it will take some time. Hopefully, Obama will have 8 years, because it's going to take at least that long. It's not something that you can do quickly, and then if there's re-election cycle and so forth. But you have to sort of take into account, you know, the trauma of what we've witnessed over time, Lebanon, Gaza, our own experiences as American Muslims, whether we're Palestinian, Pakistani, the kinds of indecencies we've been exposed to as good law-abiding American citizens for that period of time really has affected our community. And so even though you can say, well, we should give this administration credit for what it's doing, that's true, but we've lived through a lot so far, not just these past 8 years, but the previous history, the 60 years. I visited refugee camps in Lebanon. These are Palestinians from 1948. Their lives are no better than they were when they first got there. So this is a long-standing history that You're right, he can't snap his fingers, but we do believe that more can be done because we have seen when there's political will in the United States, and we mobilize American forces on our behalf, what can be done when there is that will in Washington, and that's what we're asking for. That's the sentiment that you hear, that you feel, coming from a community of people who are not Palestinian, but who care about, as Aslam said, the decency and dignity and justice for this population that really has suffered so much for such a long time. So.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed the panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists. I mean, what I take from this discussion is a deep admiration and a deep love of the United States at its best, of its values. I think that's something that we all agree on. I think there is, at times, disappointment when the nation does not live up to its values. And it is those areas where there is clearly room for criticism and room for improvement. What we would like to see, and I would encourage Tamara and the Department of Defense and the Obama administration to carry through on these policies that they've set in motion, these kind of policies that have improved standing in the Muslim world. And hopefully we will see a two-state solution. We will see Palestine born before this president leaves office. Again, thank you.